walk around, I'd like to encourage you to take a look at the Feederhouse drum. Look at it and see if it's level left or right, that nothing's caught under the drum downstops. Also, I'd take a quick glance at this Feederhouse contour master frame, see if there's any trash buildup in this area that's been pinched in there from the day operation of the oscillation with the header. And coming around this side, you'll see that we've already removed the Feederhouse shields for clarity of this video. And as you can see, we've got the Feederhouse reverser drive sheave Zerks here. There's two of them. We've got the daily maintenance that we want to check the reverser oil level with. And as we go by here, I'd like to stop and make sure that we've got an 1/8 inch sheave gap that gives us our belt tension. And as we come on back here, we'll have the Feederhouse tension spring gauge for the conveyor chain tension that we want to maintain and take a look at. Also, we have our periodic maintenance of the reverser drive sheaves and the upper variable speed Zerks back here that we want to take and pay attention to. As we continue around the left side of the machine, I want to remind you that we've got a feed accelerator bearing that we need to do periodic maintenance on. Also, daily I would like to look at this Feederhouse primary drive belt tensioner with spring and gauge. And we've got a real drive pump bearings that need a little more attention than the periodic maintenance would allow for. Also, if I was operating in muddy or wet conditions, I want to remind you about the final drive outer bearing, just giving it a few shots to keep fresh grease in that bearing and the moisture pushed out. As we continue around the left-hand side of the machine, we do have our 90-degree gear case with an oil level and a dipstick that we need to maintain. And I want to remind you that some machines won't have this oil level up there with a 5-speed power shift transmission for the Feederhouse drives. Continuing on back, we've got our vertical auger gear case lubrication point up here. On S series, we do not have that any longer, but on prior models, 50, 60, and 70 series machines, we would have a lubrication point at the bottom of the vertical auger gear case. Continuing on back, we've got our unloading auger drive chain tension with a gauge to maintain and look at daily. And as we go behind that gauge, we've also got our gear case in the 90-degree elbow for the unloading auger on a lubrication hose on periodic maintenance right here. Continuing on down, we have our diesel exhaust fluid on the final Tier 4 engines, an air filter here that's been added, that I would ask that you maybe watch for the sensor in the cab display warnings to go off before I would worry about that filter. And on down here on this left side, we have the left-hand cleaning fan bearing that has a lubrication point on it also. As we continue around the left-hand side of the machine at the rear of the machine, we have our rotor drive sheave with a lubrication point for the bushing. We also have our discharge beater left-hand bearing with a lubrication hose you can see here for the left-hand bearing. And as we come up here, remember in our periodic maintenance, we have our straw chopper upper bearing that gets greased through the grooves of the sheave up here. And our straw chopper drive belt gauge tension is located right here for the upper drive belt. The lower drive belts for the straw chopper tension would be down here on these gauges. And our discharge beater drive belt gauge is located right here. On 50 and 60 series machines, on the straw chopper drive counter shaft, we have a lubrication, 2 Zerks or lubrication points that we need to maintain there. On 70 and S series machines, they went to a factory fill lubrication that we don't have to worry about on the counter shaft. Prior to, also on the 50 and 60 and 70 series machines, we have lubrication points on either side of the straw chopper rotor bearings that we need to keep in maintenance with. And also behind this drive tire, we're going to have our pivot bushings for the spindle that we need to grease daily. Continuing on from the left-hand rear of the machine to the right-hand rear of the machine, 50, 60, and 70 series machines, we would have our straw chopper rotor bearing. On the S series, they went to factory filled bearings. From there, I would want to take a quick glance at my fuel water separator trap and just make sure that it's clean and ready for a day's service. Also, we have our right-hand rear spindle bushings that we would want to grease. And on the S series only, we have a rotary screen vacuum duct drive belt that we have a tension gauge to maintain on. And continuing on and up and forward from there, we have our rotary screen drive belt tension that we'd want to maintain. As we continue down the right-hand side of the machine, we would have our battery periodic maintenance we need to keep in mind of, our tailings elevator paddle and clean grain elevator paddle chain tensions that we need to look at daily, along with our clean grain elevator spring tension gauge that's behind the clean grain elevator, and our tailings elevator drive belt tension gauge. The tailings elevator drive chain for the tailings elevator auger to put it back into the rotor is a chain tension that we need to maintain and check daily. There's a couple lubrication points on the cleaning fan drives. We have a right-hand cleaning fan shaft bearing, but just directly behind that we also have a lubrication right on the back side of this sheave where the shaft and the sheave mate and they slide together there. We need to make sure that that lubrication point, which is one we see often missed, and also on the cleaning fan outer sheave, the throwout bearing grease zerk and the bushing on this upper sheave, there's a zerk there to daily maintenance. On the front right hand corner of the machine we have our right hand primary countershaft bearing, which is remotely lubricated from this lubrication point right here. We also have our rotor front bearing, which is lubricated off this lubrication point. We have our feed accelerator right hand bearing, which is between the spokes of the sheave. We have our feed accelerator belt tension gauge right here. We have our shoe auger drive sheave. That is a lubrication point that we see often in the inspection program that is missed and causes more upkeep and maintenance. And also our final drive, we have our outer bearing. If you're running in wet or muddy conditions, I would highly recommend daily greasing of it. On the right hand side of the feeder house we have a radial pin slip clutch for the Feederhouse drive. We introduced that in some of the 60, 70, and now the S series have it. A radial pin slip clutch has lubrication on it, and in the past some guys were scared to lubricate slip clutches. Well, a radial pin slip clutch, if you don't lubricate it enough, it'll lose its effective torque and you will start to slip your feeder house conveyor chain more often. Keeping fresh grease in that clutch is crucial for the performance of the feeder house. Also, we have our feeder house drive chain tension that needs to be adjusted with this idler sprocket. We have our spring tension on our conveyor chain tension that we need to maintain daily. And also we have a rock trap that we need to dump daily. If you have a 3-speed transmission, you have an oil level you need to check periodically. And if you have a ProDrive transmission, the oil level is maintained for you off the engine gear case. Daily periodic engine deck maintenance would be keeping our rotary screen clean, keeping the radiator, the hydraulic oil coolers, the charge air coolers all blowed out with air, diesel exhaust fluid on the 14 model and final tier 4 engines and newer, of course our diesel fuel supply, setting our feeder house on the ground. We have hydraulic reservoir oil sight glass we need to check. We have our engine oil levels, our coolant of our engine we need to maintain, and also periodically our engine air filter based on the air restriction filter sensor and the warning that comes up when the filter is plugged. Rotor driven sheave maintenance we need to maintain by greasing this zerk. It's a bushing for the rotor drive. Also in this same spot we have a rotor drive 2-speed gear case dipstick on the right hand side of the rotor drive gear case, and you'll see we have our bolts that hold the rotor drive gear case, 4 of them, that hold the rotor drive gear case to the rear of the rotor, and our draw bolt for drawing the rotor drive gear case to adjust rotor drive belt sheave gap. The rotor driven sheave, as you can see, we have an 1/8 inch pipe plug. Before we remove that pipe plug, we need to speed the rotor drive all the way up as fast as it'll go in the fastest position on the variable speed adjustment. We'll pull that pipe plug out and we'll put a grease zerk in there. With that grease zerk in, we need to take and run a tube of cornhead grease in per season, once per year. And with it all the way sped up, the cam assembly in there, the posi-torque drive rotor drive system, is in its smallest position. And if that one tube of cornhead grease goes in and there happen to be grease come out the pipe plug on the breather on the end of this cap back here, then we know we've got the system full. Either once a season we either put in 1 tube of cornhead grease, or we watch till we get grease coming out the end of that cap on that breather, and that's what lubricates our Posi-Torque drive system. The clean grain elevator fountain auger drive gear case located inside the grain tank has a dipstick that we're pointing at. That's an 80-90 weight oil only. You could use a synthetic, but it's not necessary. It runs real slow, and maintaining that oil level through the harvest season is critical.